For years, Indigenous people around the world have been subjected to stereotypes that oversimplify their culture, identities, and ways of life. One of the most common stereotypes is that all Indigenous people share one culture, belief, and practice, resulting in an obscure and ignorant way of viewing the diverse Indigenous communities across different regions and periods. This documentary will explore the geographical diversity of Indigenous cultures, the historical impact of colonialism on Indigenous identities, and the media's contribution to spreading harmful stereotypes. To truly understand and correct this stereotype, we need to understand where it came from and the origins of its past. We will dive into several key areas. Assimilation policies and genocidal history. We'll understand how government policies have been aimed at assimilating Indigenous culture, as well as acts of genocide that have served to erase and oversimplify Indigenous cultures and identities. Cultural homogenization and settler colonialism. Driven by settler colonialism, the process of cultural homogenization, the idea that different cultures transform and become more similar to each other as globalization progresses, has played a significant role in causing the idea that Indigenous cultures are all the same. Media's contribution. Finally, we will look at how media continues to spread and build up the stereotype. This includes representation in film, revision, and social media. 1831. The first residential school opened, intending to educate and convert Indigenous youth to assimilate them into Canadian society. They were forbidden to wear traditional clothing or participate in ceremonies. School staff often used numbers to refer to students instead of their names. The vast majority of children were not allowed to speak their languages at school. Canada was initially set up to dispose and assimilate Indigenous people. The residential school system was one such measure aimed at destroying Indigenous culture, traditions, and language through cultural genocide. Not only did residential schools assimilate their culture, but also cause many other problems and traumas. The living conditions in residential schools were far from ideal. They were forced into uniforms and their hair cut short, and they did not receive the same education as the general public, since the schools were underfunded. The abuse at the schools was widespread. They suffered emotional and psychological abuse constantly, and physical and sexual abuse as punishment. Many survivors recall being beaten and strapped, some shackled to their beds, and others have needles shoved into their tongues for speaking their native language. This resulted in a shockingly high death toll. Many would rather die trying to escape than stay in schools. All these experiences led to generational trauma. Many who left residential schools had to find a way to cope and turn to other ways to do so. It's estimated that anywhere between 45% to 75% of students die shortly after returning home, and those who live turn to alcohol or other toxic coping mechanisms, which then affected their kids and the ones after that. This also contributed to many other stereotypes about Indigenous people. Following the creation of residential schools, the Indian Act was first written in 1876. The main goal of the Act was to force First Nations people to lose their culture and become like Euro-Canadians. It granted the Canadian government control over many aspects of Indigenous people's lives, including the management of housing, health service, the environment, and the resources on reserves. The Indian Act of 1876 created the legal category of status Indian, a category that had long-lasting implications for First Nations of Canada. Once it entered into law, the Act imposed a single common legal definition, lumping together different nations and languages into the broad category of First Nations. The status Indian created new members of society, whose legal status and limitations were all defined by law. Among the group that were not considered Indians were Métis and Inuit people. The Indian Act had many reformers over the years. Its most offensive clauses were repealed or altered, including those restricting the movement of individuals outside reserves, outlawing Indigenous ceremonies, and discrimination against women. As the Indian Act continues to regulate significant parts of Indigenous lives, such as band membership, taxation, band government selection, rights to land and other resources, and education, a new, equally devastating policy emerged, the 60 Scoop, which tore thousands of Indigenous children from their families and cultures. Through the 1960s, Indigenous children were removed or scooped from their homes, communities, and families of birth, often without the parents' or band's consent. They were put into adoption and given to predominantly non-Indigenous middle-class families across Canada and the United States. The process first began in 1951, when the Indian Act gave the provincial jurisdiction over Indigenous child welfare. While the effective residential schools in the Indian Act in the 60s, many communities, mainly those living on reserves, have been affected by poverty, high death rates, and socioeconomic barriers. With no additional financial resources, the provincial agencies inherited many issues surrounding children and child welfare. With many communities under service and struggling, while still under the control of the Indian Act, provincial child welfare agencies decided to remove children from their homes rather than provide community resources and support. From the 1960s to the 1980s, the provincial government considered the removal of Indigenous children the fastest and easiest way of addressing Indigenous child welfare issues. More than 200,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were removed from their homes. Many were also sent abroad, some as far as New Zealand. This experience left many adoptees with a sense of loss of cultural identity. The separation, both physical and emotional, they suffered continues to affect adult adoptees and Indigenous communities to this day. On our next topic, cultural homogenization and settler colonialism. In 1637, in New France, Catholic missionaries set aside land within their seigneuries for the use and benefit of First Nations. It was expected that a settlement on those lands would assist them in converting Indigenous people into Catholicism. The colonial practice of setting aside land for Indigenous people while holding onto the legal title served as the foundation of the reserve system. As non-Indigenous settlements increased, tension grew with Indigenous people over the use and occupation of traditional land. The English colonial government used treaties as a method of acquiring Indigenous land. Those policies were extended to Canada following the conquest of New France. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 acknowledged Indigenous people land titles, which the Crown acquired through negotiation before settlement and property enclosure. Before Confederation, Indigenous people were excluded from lands surrendered by treaties, leading to forced relocation. As colonial governments acquired more land, provisions were made to reserve some for First Nations. The title to these land reserves was unclear, leading to deceptive practices. The colonial government declared these reserves retained by the Crown, protecting them from taxation and alienation. These laws were incorporated into the Indian Act. In 1885, during the Northwest Rebellion, federal officers saw a more wide-reaching policy of restriction to Indigenous movement, and the idea of a formalized pass system was born. The pass system was a route by which Indigenous people had to present travel documents authorized by an Indian agent to leave and return to their reserves. It was a way of controlling the movement of Indigenous people, aiming to prevent large gatherings which were seen as a threat by the white settlers. It was also believed that the pass system would prevent another conflict like the Northwest Rebellion. In August later that year, the pass system was successfully implemented but was never enacted as a law. After many arguments between politicians, some areas were no longer affected by the pass system, while others were to various degrees, until it was phased out in the 1930s. The loss of unrestricted travel communities significantly impacted Indigenous daily life short and long term. Things like economic and cultural practices had a significant impact. The pass system limited the goods and the locations Indigenous farmers could sell, leading to spoilage and income loss. The pass system also segregated Indigenous communities from non-Indigenous people, contributing to mistrust and social-economic inequalities. Lastly, the media's contribution to spread and build up this stereotype. Because the media can frame public events, it has played a large role in shaping how people think of Indigenous people's fights for sovereignty and the integrity of their land. During the Oka crisis, the media villainized the Indigenous people who were just protecting their land. In 1989, settlers planned to build a golf course on the ancestral land in Quebec. However, activists and Indigenous allies led to a blockade against the Canadian Armed Forces and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, leading to the cancellation of the plans. Indigenous studies scholars argue that the media, and government portrayed that the Indigenous as terrorists and downplayed calls for reconciliation and apology. A planned apology from the Canadian Department of National Defence would reinforce Aboriginal leaders' tendency to wallow in victimhood and mask continued Aboriginal militancy. Media reports often portrayed Indigenous community issues like poverty, addiction, and crime, without addressing the systematic causes like residential schools and discrimination, perpetuating negative stereotypes and overlooking Indigenous cultural resilience. To wrap it all up, I hope this documentary was able to shed light on the widespread stereotypes that for a long time plagued Indigenous people, oversimplifying their diverse cultures and identities. Through the exploration of key areas, continuing government policies of assimilation and colonial oppression, the impact of cultural homogenization, and the role of modern media, this has hopefully aided in gaining insight into the origins and perpetrations of these stereotypes. By understanding these factors, we can better approach the harmful narrative and dismantle them. We must all continue to strive for greater understanding and awareness, acknowledging the historical injustices and ongoing struggles faced by Indigenous communities, and working towards a future of respect, equality, and cultural preservation.